You're listening to the Cyberwire Network, powered by N2K.
The IT world used to be simpler. You only had to secure and manage environments that you controlled. Then came new technologies and new ways to work. Now, employees, apps, and networks are everywhere. This means poor visibility, security gaps, and added risk. That's why Cloudflare created the first-ever connectivity cloud. Visit cloudflare.com to protect your business everywhere you do business. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CyberWire's Research Saturday. I'm Dave Bittner, and this is our weekly conversation with researchers and analysts tracking down the threats and vulnerabilities, solving some of the hard problems, and protecting ourselves in a rapidly evolving cyberspace. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, so this is a yearly report that we do, basically looking at what are the indicators that we can derive from our reporting, our research, our data, and what kind of conclusions can we draw between that and maybe some ransomware trends that we might be seeing in the broader community. And then sort of larger look at the longitudinal nature of ransomware events over time. And, what are we seeing? Are we seeing increases? Are we seeing changes to actor TTPs, et cetera?
That's Trevor Hilligoss, Vice President of SpyCloud Labs. Today we're discussing their newly released 2024 Malware and Ransomware Defense Report. So the story here is ransomware, and before we dig into some of the details, can we start with some sort of a broad description? In your mind, where do we find ourselves when it comes to this ransomware threat?
Well, we find ourselves in the same kind of place that we have been, maybe a little bit worse. There are some trends that we don't love to see. Ransomware payments becoming a little bit more common this year over last year. There are certainly some positives, though. We've seen some fantastic law enforcement actions on the part of the National Crime Agency in the UK, the Federal Bureau of Investigation here in the US, and others, seizing the infrastructure, putting out indictments on the actors that are behind these groups. So I guess it is kind of a mixed bag, but we would all like to see ransomware be much diminished, and it's pretty clear that that's not the case this year.
Yeah. One of the things that caught my eye as I was making my way through the research here was the prevalence of Infostealer malware and the part that plays in, I guess we could say, the ransomware ecosystem. Can we touch on that? And for folks who may not be really tuned into it, how do you and your team define Infostealers themselves?
Yeah, that's a good question, Dave. So Infostealers, when we talk about Infostealers, we're really talking about a type of malware. This is often sold as malware as a service. So you can think of malware as a service kind of similar to software as a service, right? Where you maybe pay a monthly subscription fee to a company that gets you access to software that has been designed by someone else. You can use it. Maybe you can use it for commercial gain. If something goes wrong, you have a support network. You can reach out to somebody and troubleshoot on your behalf. And it's a recurring license. So that same model exists in the criminal ecosystem. So when we're talking about Infostealer malware, the vast majority of this stuff is sold kind of on the criminal underground by malware developers to end users. And so these folks buy access to the malware. Some of them come with kind of a built-in panel that the end user can use to, look at the proceeds of their infections and create custom builds of the malware and do other things. Others are much more bare bones. But this really is kind of a burgeoning economy that we've seen kind of continually grow since sort of the pre-pandemic days.
And how are the Infostealers finding their way onto people's systems here? What are the weaknesses that they take advantage of?
Well, it kind of varies.
Hmm.
We see a whole range of initial access methods, some of which are quite sophisticated. The vast majority are not. We see things like, game cheats, add-ons for popular games pushed. We see malvertising is kind of a significant avenue that these stealers tend to make their way onto the victim endpoints. The goal here is really one of scale. So, depending on the malware, you might look at something as a very targeted attack where, someone has some ill intent towards you specifically, and so they develop this very sophisticated attack chain that targets you, and maybe they know, what kind of hardware or software, what versions you're using, and can exploit a vulnerability therein. Infostealers tend to be deployed much more to whom it may concern, right? These things are staged in places where a lot of people will come into contact with them and therefore become infected. So there's this whole economy that kind of supports the infostealer economy, aimed at sorting through the data that's been exfiltrated and identifying things that they can then, either sell themselves. Maybe we're talking about an install broker that's going to sell access an access broker that's going to sell that access to a ransomware affiliate, or a much lower level, somebody that's interested in just stealing some credit cards and selling those on a carding marketplace. It kind of runs the gambit in terms of sophistication.
Hmm. And again, as I was looking through the research here, is it fair to say that in a lot of the cases here that these two things go hand in hand, that the info stealer can almost be a predictor for a ransomware attempt?
Maybe.
Am I overstating it a little?
Well, I don't know. I am going to hedge my bets a little bit. Let me actually take a step back and kind of walk
Yeah.
through sort of the methodology here, because I think it's important to understand that, especially when people are making big claims. So essentially, what we did is we took a set of data on publicly known ransomware events. So basically, when ransomware actors are successful or claim that they're successful, oftentimes they'll go out on a blog that they maintain, or some other site, and name and shame the company. Right. This is especially true when people don't pay. So we pulled in that as kind of a good data set of likely ransomware events, likely successful ransomware events. And then we basically built out sort of a manifest of each one of those companies, all of their domain names that they use. And then we took those domain names and looked within our own holdings, especially our Infostealer records, and kind of turned back the clock to see, historically 12, 16 weeks before an event took place, before we have information that an event took place, what was that company's or that organization's total security posture as it pertains to information security, information stealing malware. And what we found was at least a correlation. We found about 1/3 of the companies that we had in that pool of likely ransomware events had an Infostealer infection within the prior 16 weeks. So there's obviously a lot to unpack there, and I'm happy to kind of go into a little bit more of the technical details of sort of why we made choices that we made. But
Yeah.
the top line number there, 30%, that's pretty significant, and I think it's something that certainly deserves additional research and discussion at a minimum.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's dig into some of those details then. Can you share with us some of the methodologies here that you all used?
Yeah, so let me first start with that 16-week number. It might seem a little arbitrary. I guess it is a little arbitrary. But we're dealing with the date that a ransomware actor posts that something happened, right? So we kind of have to infer when the actual event took place, and in many cases it's impossible to do that, right? It could have been the day before, could have been the week before, a month before. All we can essentially say with certainty is that the event took place before the actor posted it. So we did 16 weeks. That does kind of break down. There's some interesting things about, well, if it's Luma C2 versus Redline, does that impact the date that we tend to see correlating to that ransomware event? But the sort of big takeaway there is that an info stealer infection of a corporate device or of an individual with access to a corporate environment does significantly elevate your total risk, certainly, but more specifically, it seems to elevate the risk of a ransomware event.
We'll be right back. And now, a word from our sponsor, Maltego. Maltego's all-in-one platform for OSINT and investigations speeds up complex investigations from hours to minutes. Trusted by half of Dow Jones and governments around the world, it helps cyber threat intelligence teams, fraud analysts, and law enforcement agencies integrate the most relevant data and enhance situational awareness to combat crime and mitigate risks. Detect threats early and solve cases quickly. Go to www.maltego.com/get-a-demo to explore how Maltego keeps businesses and the public safe. That's www.maltego.com/get-a-demo. Now a word from our sponsor, the Johns Hopkins University Information Security Institute, currently seeking qualified applicants for its innovative Master of Science in Security Informatics degree program. Study alongside world-class interdisciplinary experts and gain unparalleled educational, research, and professional experience in information security and assurance. Interested U.S. citizens should consider the National Science Foundation's CyberCore Scholarship for Service program, which covers tuition, required fees, university-sponsored health insurance, and a $6,000 annual professional development allowance, as well as providing a $37,000 additional annual stipend. Apply for the scholarship and the spring semester by November 15th. Learn more at cs.jhu.edu/MSSI. Yeah, that's an interesting correlation here. And so what are the other connections you make? Having made that connection, where does that take your line of thinking?
Well, I'll tell you where it takes my line of thinking, because I'm something of an Infostealer nerd. I've been interested in this very niche segment of malware for a long time. My mind initially went to, is there something? Is it specific to the stealer? Right? Do we see like some crazy difference between, a modern stealer with some very sophisticated methods, maybe it targets something very specific that we can kind of infer that that's a higher risk. Unfortunately, there's kind of a mixed bag. You look at the stealers that we identified as being significantly correlated with ransomware. Number one is Luma C2, which for anybody that understands stealers and has researched this segment, it's probably not a surprise. Luma's pretty advanced as a within the field of stealers. They've come out with some significant improvements over a lot of other stealers. Earlier this year, they had the Google cookie refresh that then spread to other stealers, of course, but it started with Luma. But then you have in the number two spot, Redline, which Redline is a totally competent stealer, but it's older. It's been around for several years. Doesn't really share a lot of the modernizations that Luma C2 has. But it has a significant user base, so that could potentially be the reason that we see it there in the number two spot. And then number three is StealC, which we go back to, a not super sophisticated stealer, doesn't have a ton of market saturation, relatively new. So, how do I explain that? I'm still kind of untangling my emotions on that one, I guess, Dave.
Well, help me understand kind of the Infostealer ecosystem here. I mean, you've alluded to it that there are varying degrees of sophistication. Is there the high end, the high-end sports car version of an Infostealer versus, the daily driver? Do they attract different audiences, people who have different amounts of resources to throw at this problem?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So I guess I like the metaphor there, sports car versus a minivan, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, there definitely is. So we've seen over the past couple of years, one of the things that has kind of come out as a significant difference between Stealers, malware in general, but especially Stealers, is the method by which it exfiltrates data. So, historically, if you're looking at malware, even malware as a service that is, a commodity you can purchase, you don't have to write it yourself. There is still kind of an access cost that comes with that, largely in the way that the infrastructure is set up. So, historically, you buy access to Raccoon, for example. Well, that's a bad example. That's a centralized stealer. But a non-centralized stealer, you would have to gain access to infrastructure. You'll probably have to set that up yourself. Maybe there's some guides you could follow, but it does require a little bit more technical acumen than maybe the normal person off the street would have. These days, a lot of stealers are kind of going the opposite direction. So we see a lot of exfiltration through messaging applications like Telegram, for example, where the actor, the end user, doesn't have to do much more than just getting access to an API key that they can use. So that certainly sort of lowers the barrier to entry for these kind of things. But in terms of what makes this so significant and what makes this interesting, I think I kind of take the perspective of the broader ecosystem. And when we're talking about that, you're looking at things like install services that can get you access to, infrastructure that's already ready made for you, the ad networks, for example, cryptors that can make it very easy to bypass things like antivirus, even very good antivirus. And then there's sort of this whole backend infrastructure marketplace that exists after the infections take place to sort through the logs, pull out that interesting information, be able to market that information to other criminals that might pay for it, for example. So this is I would call this a very mature ecosystem, and it's one that we see constantly increasing in maturity and in scale.
Hmm. What about the professionalism, for lack of a better word, of the providers here? I mean, is there, do they have respect for each other? Or are they trash talking each other? Or how does that play out?
Yeah, good question. There's no honor amongst thieves. I think we've seen recently, well, whether it's the Alpha Black Hat exit scamming, whether it's actors that are kind of doing their own pump and dump schemes of various degrees of success. We're talking about criminals here. I don't think there's a ton of honor in the system.
Mm-hmm.
There is definitely a lot of collaboration here. I mean, we do see, for example, malware as a service. Oftentimes, when you purchase access to a stealer, you will get that bundled with, for example, a checker. So a checker is something that you can use to go through the logs, the data that's been exfiltrated, and identify things of interest, identify software wallets, crypto wallets, that kind of stuff. And maybe you'll get a 1 month free access to a checker when you buy access to a stealer. I'll commonly see cryptors being bundled to a lot of malware. Developers will actually require that you use a cryptor because they don't want their build to be compromised, uploaded to VirusTotal. So there is definitely a lot of collaboration there as it pertains to kind of like criminal to criminal and especially financial gain. I can't say that there's profit sharing or anything like that. I mean, we can kind of infer that that's probably happening, but I don't have any evidence of that. But as far as trash talking, yes, absolutely. Everybody talks trash on the internet. Criminals are certainly no exception to that. And so it definitely does happen. Even between communities, people on breach forums don't like people on exploit. People on XSS, might have a problem with English-speaking Telegram group. Who knows? It certainly does happen, and it is comical to watch.
Well, I mean, getting back to this year's ransomware defense report, I mean, based on the information that you all have gathered here, what are your recommendations? What are the takeaways for folks?
Well, I think the takeaways are certainly keep doing the things that have been recommended, and continue to be recommended, right? So keep monitoring for vulnerabilities, keep patching those vulnerabilities as they come up. Use multi-factor authentication, enforce multi-factor authentication. Make sure that you have short-lived authentication cookies. Make sure that you have visibility into what devices are accessing your network. Certainly, if you have that ability to have that visibility. What we're recommending is kind of one step further, which is sort of the awareness and monitoring level, especially as it pertains to exposed information. So, a wise man once said, "The internet is forever." I have no reason to doubt that claim. When information is stolen, whether it's stolen by a hacker that gains access to a database or a stealer that lands on somebody's endpoint, that information is out there, right? It might be that it's not that first person, the first person that acquired that data that's going to use it maliciously, but likely someone will eventually, right? So you can't really undo. There's no undo button for the internet, unfortunately. Once something is out there, it is there forever. So the best you can do is have awareness, right? Be able to identify what data is exposed, what data about your employees, about yourself, about your customers is exposed, and then be able to effectively create whatever controls you can to prevent that data being misused. So maybe that's being aware of live cookies being stolen and being able to invalidate those sessions. Maybe it's identifying credentials that have been exposed. Forcing credential resets, prompting or forcing MFA, forcing the adoption of hardware tokens. Those are all very good things. And I think, anything above having no idea that something happened is a great start and will certainly do you quite well as we all try to prevent the spread of ransomware.
What's your sense for where we're headed here? I mean, it seems to me like we might not necessarily be gaining ground or losing ground. Like it seems like a tense equilibrium at this particular moment. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, we don't know what we don't know, and I'll readily admit. I mean, one of the problems or one of the things that we're aware of in our analysis of the relationship between stealer malware and ransomware is, we only know about what was announced publicly. Many times, ransomware, ransoms happen, data is exfiltrated, extortion occurs, and never gets publicly posted, right? Whether that's, somebody negotiated something, a ransom was paid, who knows? So we don't really know the full scope of this problem. I don't think we really ever will, because that information is just not out there. But I think as long as this is profitable, it will happen. Crime is not a new phenomenon. Cybercrime might be kind of a brave new frontier, but crime has been happening for a long time, and especially financially motivated crime. I don't really see that as being something that you can just wave your magic wand and stop. I think the best thing for all of us to do is make it as difficult as possible for these guys to be successful. And then at least if we can raise the bar to entry, that will diminish the number of successful events and thus the number of ransomware actors that are out there in the wild.
And that's Research Saturday, brought to you by N2K Cyberwire. Our thanks to Trevor Hilligoss from SpyCloud Labs for joining us. We'll have a link to their 2024 Malware and Ransomware Defense Report in the show notes. We'd love to know what you think of this podcast. Your feedback ensures we deliver the insights that keep you a step ahead in the rapidly changing world of cybersecurity. If you like our show, please share a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. Please also fill out the survey in the show notes or send an email to cyberwire@n2k.com. We're privileged that N2K Cyberwire is part of the daily routine of the most influential leaders and operators in the public and private sector. From the Fortune 500 to many of the world's preeminent intelligence and law enforcement agencies. N2K makes it easy for companies to optimize your biggest investment, your people. We make you smarter about your teams while making your teams smarter. Learn how at n2k.com. This episode was produced by Liz Stokes. We're mixed by Elliot Peltzman and Trey Hester. Our executive producer is Jennifer Iben. Our executive editor is Brandon Karpf. Simone Petrella is our president. Peter Kilpie is our publisher. And I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back here next time.